The sun had just risen when Maya stepped out of her small apartment that morning. The air was calm, and the street was quiet, only a few people rushing to work. She wore a simple blue dress, carried her brown leather bag, and walked with steady steps toward the courthouse. To anyone passing by, it was just another woman going about her day. But to Maya, this day carried a small hope. She had spent weeks preparing for a simple legal matter. It was something she could solve in just a few minutes. At least that was what she believed. She had always trusted the system. She believed that if you followed the rules, the system would treat you fairly. She had no idea that this would be the day that changed everything. When Maya entered the courthouse, the cold air from the air conditioner brushed against her face. She took a deep breath and walked to the front desk to collect her ticket. The woman at the counter didn't smile, but Maya didn't mind. She had dealt with unfriendly faces before. She sat down in the waiting area with other people. Everyone was quiet. The walls were painted white, and the clock on the wall ticked slowly. Maya's fingers tapped softly on her bag as she waited for her number to be called. She thought about finishing the task quickly, and then heading to the small cafe across the street for coffee. Finally, a loud voice called her name from the courtroom door. She stood up and walked in with confidence. The courtroom had wooden benches, a raised platform for the judge, and 2 police officers standing near the wall. Maya had visited courtrooms before for her work, but she had never stood here for her own personal matter. She straightened her back and took her place at the front. The judge sat behind the big desk. He was an older man with silver hair and a serious face, but what caught Maya's attention was not his age. It was the way he looked at her. It was a sharp, judging look, as if he had already made up his mind about her before she even spoke. Maya told herself not to take it personally. She focused on her paperwork and spoke clearly about her case. But as she began to explain, the judge leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and smiled in a way that didn't feel right. The 2 police officers at the side also exchanged glances. One of them even whispered something, and the other chuckled softly. Maya felt a cold knot forming in her stomach, but she kept talking calmly. She believed that if she just explained everything clearly, they would listen. Then the judge interrupted her. He didn't ask questions to understand. His tone was dismissive, as if her words didn't matter. He spoke to her like she was a problem, not a person. He raised his eyebrows and made small remarks that made the people in the room turn their heads. Maya tried to stay calm, but every word he spoke made her feel smaller. The officer at the side smirked, and Maya saw it. For the first time that day, she felt something shift inside her. Not anger, but a heavy sadness mixed with disbelief. She had worked hard all her life. She had always believed in fairness. She paid her bills, helped in her community, and even worked with local organizations. But in that room, none of that mattered. All they saw was a face they didn't respect. All they heard was a voice they didn't want to listen to. When she tried to defend herself, the judge raised his hand to silence her. She froze for a second, realizing that this was not about right or wrong. This was about power. The police officer stepped a little closer, as if to remind her of where she stood. A few people sitting in the back of the courtroom watched silently. No one spoke up. No one said a word. Maya took a deep breath and tried again. She explained every detail of her paperwork. But the judge didn't even look at the papers properly. Instead, he leaned to one side, whispered something to the clerk, and then looked at her with a blank face. He gave a short statement that made it sound like she was the one causing trouble. It wasn't just unfair, it was humiliating. She could feel the weight of those eyes on her, the quiet laugh of the officer, and the complete lack of respect in the judge's voice. The moment was short, but to Maya, it felt endless. She had always believed that if you did the right thing, you'd be treated with respect. But in that room, the truth was different. Power could twist what was fair. It could make a woman who had done nothing wrong feel like she was on trial for existing. She left the courtroom with her papers still in hand, but something inside her had changed. As she stepped outside, the sunlight was bright, but she didn't feel warm. She walked slowly down the courthouse steps, holding her bag tightly. She didn't cry. Maya was not the kind of woman who cried easily, but her heart was heavy. She had felt small in that room. She had felt invisible. But deep down, there was a quiet fire that had begun to burn. She walked past the cafe she had planned to stop at. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, but she didn't even turn her head. She kept walking step by step as her mind replayed every detail, the way the judge smirked, the way the officers laughed, the silence of the room. It all played in her head like a movie she couldn't pause. Maya reached home, placed her bag on the table, and sat down in silence. She stared at the wall for a few minutes. The humiliation she felt didn't make her weaker. It made something else come alive, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She had spent years learning how systems worked. She knew how to find answers, and she knew how to use the law. The people who humiliated her didn't know that she had once worked in a place where she learned how to fight unfair power without shouting. Without breaking, without fear, she opened her laptop slowly, still hearing their voices in her head. But now her breathing was steady. Her hands were not shaking. She was no longer that quiet woman sitting on a courtroom bench. She was someone who had a mission. That night, while the courthouse lights went off and the city grew quiet, Maya began searching. She didn't make loud promises. She didn't call anyone. She simply started collecting small pieces of information, pieces that would soon come together like puzzle parts. They had mocked her in public, thinking she would walk away like everyone else. But Maya was not everyone else. She had walked out of that courthouse feeling small. She would walk back one day, not as the humiliated woman, but as the woman who would shake their empire from the ground. This was the beginning of something much bigger than they could ever imagine. That night, after the long and painful day at the courthouse, Maya sat alone at her small wooden table. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room. She stared at her laptop screen, but her mind was still playing the scene from the courtroom again and again. The judge's dismissive tone, the quiet laugh of the officer, the silence of the people watching. It all echoed in her head like a song she didn't want to hear. She could have gone to sleep. She could have cried, complained, or given up. But Maya had never been someone who accepted injustice quietly. She had spent years working behind the scenes in places where she learned exactly how power worked, how some people used it to protect, and how some used it to control. She understood that behind many powerful people were quiet, hidden truths they never wanted the world to see. Maya opened a small folder on her laptop that she hadn't touched in years. Inside it were old documents from her time working at a federal office. Nothing illegal, just tools she had learned to use. How to access public records, how to read financial reports, and how to follow legal paper trails that most people ignored. She leaned closer to the screen, her eyes focused. "This isn't about me anymore," she whispered to herself. "This is about what they've been doing to many others like me." She began typing in the courthouse's name and the judge's name into a public database. At first, nothing seemed strange, just regular cases, rulings, and schedules. But Maya knew where to look deeper. She clicked on the property records, then the financial disclosures, then connected them to local business licenses, and slowly, like pieces of a puzzle sliding into place, small patterns began to appear. There were businesses registered under different names but linked to the same addresses. There were donations made to unknown organizations that all seemed to lead back to one source. And there were companies that were quietly taking money from local projects. Companies that were connected to people who sat in positions of power in that very courthouse. Her heartbeat grew steady and strong. This wasn't just a bad day. This was something bigger, much bigger. She got up from the table and made herself a cup of tea. The night was quiet. Outside, the city lights flickered and a soft wind blew through the street. But inside her small apartment, the energy was shifting. She wasn't just a woman who had been humiliated. She was now a woman who had found a reason to fight back. Maya returned to the table and opened more public files. She went through the judge's connections. She checked the names of the 2 police officers who had laughed at her. She looked at the names of people who worked in that courthouse. She didn't hack anything, and she didn't need to. All she had to do was follow the public paper trail. Most people never bothered looking, but she knew where to search. As the hours passed, something remarkable began to take shape. She found out that one of the businesses connected to the courthouse had received millions in public funding for security projects. Another company, owned by a relative of someone on the police board, was renting out buildings to the courthouse at inflated prices. There were contracts, signatures, and amounts that didn't match the work done. She whispered softly. They thought no one would look. She opened a fresh document and started taking careful notes. Every name, every company, every connection, every date. She made no mistakes. Maya was patient. She had spent years learning how to handle complicated systems. Now she was using that skill for something deeply personal. The clock ticked past midnight, but she didn't stop. Her tea had gone cold. Her eyes were tired, but her focus was stronger than ever. She looked at an old framed photo on the wall, a photo of her parents. They had raised her to stand for what was right, even when it was hard. And right now she knew what she had to do. The next step was clear in her mind. She needed proof, real proof. Something that no one could ignore, twist, or silence. She checked the financial statements of the courthouse and the town council. Then she compared them with the records of the companies she had found. When she placed them side by side, the numbers told a story that was louder than any courtroom speech. Money was moving quietly from public funds to private hands, but Maya also knew one thing very clearly. Powerful people don't fall easily. They protect themselves. She couldn't just walk in and shout about what she found. She needed to be smart. She needed to build something solid, something so strong that when it came out, not even the judge or the officers could deny it. She decided to contact someone she trusted. There was an old friend, Daniel, who worked as a journalist. Years ago, they had worked on a project together that exposed a company for harming the environment. Daniel had always said to her, "The truth is like water. It may be blocked for a while, but it always finds its way out." Maya picked up her phone and sent him a short message. "I need to talk. It's big, and it's real." Within a few minutes, Daniel replied, "Tomorrow morning. My office early." Maya finally closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. Her eyes were heavy, but her heart felt lighter. For the first time since that awful moment in the courtroom, she felt something she hadn't felt that day. Power. Not the kind of power that the judge and police had. This was quiet power, the kind that comes from truth. Before going to bed, she carefully saved all the files on an external drive. She placed the drive inside a small box and hid it in her bookshelf. She also emailed a copy of the notes to a secure address. If anything happened, the truth would not disappear. As she lay in bed, the silence of the night wrapped around her. She thought about all the people who must have stood in that same courtroom before her, feeling small, feeling helpless, walking away without a voice. She realized she wasn't just doing this for herself anymore. She was doing it for them too. The next morning, Maya woke up early. She wore a plain white shirt, tied her hair back neatly, and carried her bag. She walked down the street with quiet determination. People around her were heading to work, busy with their own lives, unaware of the storm she was about to create. Daniel's office was small but filled with energy. He looked at her seriously when she walked in. She placed the folder of notes and the drive on the table. He raised an eyebrow. "Maya, what is this?" She looked at him straight in the eyes and said softly but firmly, "This is the truth, and it's worth $330 million, and Daniel leaned forward and began reading. Page after page, he saw the same thing Maya had seen the night before. Patterns, connections, money trails, names. Everything was real. His face slowly changed from curiosity to shock. "Maya," he whispered, this is huge." She nodded slowly. "Yes, and they have been using their power to humiliate people like me for years. But it ends now." The moment felt heavy but clear. Maya had no intention of shouting or fighting in anger. Her fight would be calm, quiet, and powerful. She had chosen a different battlefield, one built on truth, evidence, and justice. As Daniel began planning how to bring the information into the light, Maya sat silently in his office, watching the city through the window. Yesterday they made her feel invisible. Today she was becoming the woman they would never forget. The judge and police had built a wall of power, but behind that wall was a web of secrets, and Maya had just found the loose thread. One pull, a careful, patient pull, and everything would start to unravel. Her story was no longer just her own. It was about everyone who had been silenced before, and this was only the beginning. The morning sun rose slowly through Maya's window, but she barely noticed. She had spent the previous night laying the foundation for something big. She had found the threads that could unravel everything. Now it was time to weave those threads together into something solid, something so strong that the judge, the police, and their entire hidden network could not deny it. She sat at her desk with her hair tied back, a cup of warm coffee by her side, and her laptop open. She didn't feel fear. She felt focused. She had lived through humiliation in that courtroom, and now she was turning it into fuel. Daniel, the journalist she had contacted, had already promised to bring in his team. He trusted her, but they needed hard evidence and something so clear and clean that it could hold up to any challenge. So Maya began her day by carefully building her plan. She listed out everything she needed: documents, proof of transactions, connections between people, witness statements, and timelines. She knew from her past work that power often hides in plain sight. These people didn't expect anyone to look. They relied on silence. But Maya had no intention of staying silent. She started with the companies she had traced the night before. One by one, she pulled their financial records from public databases. Many of these companies had received large government contracts. But when she looked deeper, she noticed something strange. The same set of people were involved in all of them, using different company names. It was a carefully built web, designed to confuse anyone who tried to follow the trail. But to Maya, it was like a map waiting to be read. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Daniel. "We have 2 trusted reporters ready to help. We'll keep your name private until you say otherwise." Maya felt a small warmth in her chest. She wasn't alone anymore. She replied with a short message. "Let's move carefully." Later that afternoon, she met Daniel and his team in a quiet cafe on the edge of town. The reporters listened carefully as Maya explained everything she had found. She didn't speak with anger. She spoke with precision, like someone who understood every step of the game. She showed them the contracts, the payments, and the family connections behind the businesses. The journalists were stunned by how deep it went. One of them asked softly, "Maya, are you sure you want to take this on? These people have power." Maya looked at him with calm, steady eyes. "They humiliated me in a room full of people. I walked out quietly, but I didn't walk away. I'm not afraid of the truth." The team began working with her, cross-checking everything she found. One journalist searched through government spending reports. Another went through court cases involving the judge and officers. And Maya dug even deeper into public registries. Slowly, they began connecting the dots. They found that the judge had approved contracts for companies that didn't even have proper addresses. They found that the police department had received funding for equipment that didn't exist. They found that family members of court officials owned expensive properties bought through these companies. And they discovered that over the years, this hidden network had quietly moved hundreds of millions of dollars around, protected by titles, power, and silence. As the puzzle came together, Maya felt something growing inside her. It wasn't anger anymore, it was clarity. She realized this wasn't just about her humiliation. It was about the people who had walked into that courtroom before her, with their heads down, thinking they didn't matter. She remembered the faces she saw that day in the courtroom, the young man sitting quietly at the back, the older woman holding papers nervously, the mother clutching her child. How many of them had faced the same disrespect? How many had given up? Maya decided she wouldn't let their silence be wasted. One evening, after a full day of research, she sat with Daniel in his office. "We need people," she said softly. "Real people who can speak. It's not enough to have numbers and papers. We need voices." Daniel nodded. "We can reach out carefully, quietly. There are always people who've seen things. They just need to feel safe to speak." They started contacting community members one by one, not through big announcements but through trusted connections. An older clerk who once worked in the courthouse agreed to meet with them. She shared stories of files being moved overnight, contracts being signed without proper review, and people being pushed out of their jobs for asking questions. Then they found a retired officer. At first he was quiet and distant, but when Maya shared her own experience, something softened in his eyes. He admitted he had seen suspicious behavior for years but had stayed silent out of fear of losing everything. Now retired, he wanted to help. He shared documents and details Maya had never seen before. Every testimony they gathered built the case stronger. Maya documented everything carefully. She didn't want emotion to cloud the facts. She wanted truth clean and clear. But with each step, she also understood the risk. These were powerful people with deep connections. The more she uncovered, the more she had to protect the evidence. She made multiple copies of every document, saving them in different secure places. She even gave copies to Daniel's team to make sure the truth couldn't disappear. One night, while she was walking home from a late meeting with the journalists, she felt a chill in the air. She paused at the corner and looked around. She wasn't sure if anyone was watching her, but she knew the risk was real. But instead of fear, she felt determination. She had already been humiliated once. She had already faced the worst kind of silence. She wasn't going to turn back now. The next morning, Daniel called her with urgency in his voice. "Maya, we just found something big. One of the companies received millions for court renovations, but the courthouse hasn't changed in years. No construction, no upgrades, nothing." Maya's hands tightened on the phone. "Then where did the money go?" "That's exactly what we're going to find out," Daniel said. Together, they traced the payment to another company under a different name, owned by someone related to the judge. It was like pulling on a thread and watching the entire fabric start to unravel. The amount was not small. It was part of a huge chain of hidden deals. Maya took a deep breath. This was the moment she had been working toward. They now had evidence strong enough to bring everything to light. But they couldn't rush. They had to move smartly. They started contacting national journalists who could protect the story and make sure it couldn't be silenced locally. A respected legal organization agreed to review the files. Maya also reached out to a lawyer she trusted, a woman who had spent her career defending people who didn't have a voice. The lawyer looked through everything carefully and then said something that made Maya's heart race. "Maya, what you have here isn't just a small case. This could expose a massive network. But you must be ready. Once this starts, you can't turn back." Maya nodded. She wasn't backing down. Not after everything she had seen. Not after everything they had done to people like her. That night she sat alone again, but it didn't feel the same as the first night. Back then she felt broken. Now she felt like a storm was gathering. Not a storm of chaos, but a storm of truth. She imagined the judge sitting in his chair, the officers laughing quietly, thinking they were untouchable. She pictured the cold courtroom where they tried to make her feel small. And then she smiled softly. They had no idea what was coming. Maya didn't plan to destroy anyone with noise or anger. She planned to bring down their $330 million empire with truth, patience, and courage. And now, she had everything she needed to do it. This was no longer the story of a woman being humiliated in a courtroom. This was the story of a woman rising from silence, gathering strength and preparing to shake an entire system to its core. And soon, the world would know. The sky was cloudy on the morning everything changed. Maya woke up earlier than usual. She sat at the edge of her bed for a few quiet moments, listening to the soft sound of the city waking up. It was the kind of silence before a storm, not a dangerous storm, but a powerful one that couldn't be stopped. She had spent weeks building a mountain of truth, collecting every document, every piece of proof, every name and number, and now the world was about to hear it. On the kitchen table sat a small black folder. Inside that folder was everything she had gathered, the money trail, the contracts, the testimonies, the timelines, and the links that connected the judge, the police officers, and the network behind them. She ran her hand slowly over the folder. This little bundle of papers had the power to bring down an empire worth millions, an empire built on silence and arrogance. She got dressed carefully, not in fancy clothes, but in something that made her feel strong. A plain white blouse, dark jeans, and the same leather bag she had carried the day she walked into that courtroom. She remembered the laughter, the disrespect, the way they made her feel small. But today, she wasn't walking into that building as a quiet woman. She was walking in as someone who held the truth in her hands. Outside, Daniel and his team were waiting for her near the courthouse. The journalist team had spent the last week verifying every detail. National reporters had been alerted. Government investigators had already been sent the files. They had also contacted a trusted lawyers association to make sure the truth wouldn't disappear behind closed doors. Everything had been planned carefully. When Maya stepped out of her apartment, Daniel gave her a small nod. He didn't need to say anything. They both understood what was about to happen. They walked together toward the courthouse. The same steps she had walked down weeks ago, head lowered, heart heavy, now felt completely different. People were gathering outside, not just locals, but reporters with cameras and microphones. The courthouse workers, who were used to quiet mornings, were whispering to each other, sensing that something big was coming. Inside the courthouse, the judge and the two police officers arrived, unaware of the storm waiting for them. They had grown so comfortable in their power that they didn't imagine someone like Maya could ever touch them. To them, She was just another face in a long line of people who would walk in and walk out silently. But they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Daniel's team handed copies of the folder to several key journalists and legal observers who were already present. Maya didn't speak loudly. She didn't need to. The evidence would speak for itself. At exactly 9:30 in the morning, the first news alert went out. The national press released an investigative story with a bold headline that spread like wildfire online. It exposed the hidden connections between the judge, local police, and a private network of companies that had quietly controlled more than $330 million in funds. The story named names, showed documents, and explained everything clearly. It was no longer whispers. It was public. As the news spread, reporters began asking questions outside the courthouse. Cameras turned to the judge's car as he arrived. He looked surprised to see the crowd, then uncomfortable when microphones were pushed toward him. Someone shouted a question about the money trail. Another shouted about secret contracts. For the first time, he didn't have the power to control the room. Maya stood quietly to the side, watching it unfold. She didn't need to be at the center of the storm. She was the one who lit the spark, and now the truth was burning through the layers of their false power. Minutes later, federal investigators arrived. Their timing was not an accident. Daniel's team had made sure the story would break at the exact moment officials stepped in. The investigators entered the building with calm authority. They didn't shout. They simply handed official notices and began their work. Inside the judge's office, whispers turned into panic. Phones rang nonstop. People who had always walked with straight backs were now speaking in hurried tones. The two police officers who had laughed at Maya in the courtroom stood by the hallway, confused and nervous. They didn't know that their signatures were on several documents tied to fake contracts. Reporters crowded outside the building, recording every moment. Maya stayed calm. She didn't want revenge, she wanted justice. Daniel walked up to her and said softly, "They're finished." But Maya didn't smile. She wasn't celebrating yet. She knew this was just the beginning of a long process. But one thing was clear. The wall of silence had been broken. Later that morning, the lead investigator held a short press conference outside. In a clear and measured voice, he announced that an official investigation had been launched into the courthouse's financial activities. He confirmed that multiple individuals, including senior officials, were suspected of misusing millions in public funds. The crowd buzzed with energy. Some people who had once felt powerless started to step forward, telling reporters about their experiences. A woman said softly into the microphone, "I went to that judge 2 years ago. They treated me like I was nothing." Another man said, "I always knew something was wrong here, but I didn't have proof." Maya watched them, her eyes soft. These were the voices that had been silent for too long. Now, they were speaking. Inside the courthouse, the judge sat in his chair trying to keep control. But control was slipping fast. One by one, the people around him began to distance themselves. Old alliances cracked like thin glass. Those who had once laughed confidently were now looking over their shoulders. By noon, the story was everywhere. On television, on phones, in conversations all across the city. National and international reporters were repeating the same words. $330 million network exposed. Legal investigation underway. Maya walked to the cafe across from the courthouse, the same one she had ignored on the day she was humiliated. She sat by the window, this time not with pain, but with quiet strength. She sipped her coffee as she watched the courthouse steps fill with reporters and officials. Daniel joined her. "They'll remember this day," he said. Maya looked at the courthouse and replied softly, "I don't want them to remember me. I want them to remember what truth can do." As the afternoon went on, arrests were not made yet, but investigations began to move fast. People who had once seemed untouchable were being questioned. Every contract, every file, every hidden deal was now under the spotlight. For Maya, it was not just about the judge or the officers. It was about sending a message. Power built on injustice can be shaken, even by someone they tried to humiliate. That evening, as the sun began to set, she walked past the courthouse once more. The building looked the same as it always had, tall, serious, intimidating. But it no longer held the same weight it did that day when she had stood inside, feeling small. This time the building felt smaller. She paused for a moment on the steps where everything began. People passed by, some recognizing her but not saying anything. She didn't need applause. She didn't need attention. The truth was out, and that was enough. Daniel's team kept working through the night, pushing the story forward, making sure it wouldn't disappear quietly. The legal team secured more files. Witnesses came forward. The walls of the hidden empire were breaking piece by piece. And somewhere inside, the judge sat alone in his office, staring at the phone, knowing he could no longer silence the truth. Maya walked home slowly, feeling the cool air against her face. This journey had begun with humiliation, but it had turned into something much greater. She had stood alone once, but now many voices had joined her. The woman who had once been dismissed as no one important had shown what quiet strength could do. The empire that thought it could never fall was now shaking under the weight of its own secrets. And this was just the beginning of the change that was coming. Maya didn't look back as she closed her door that night. She didn't need to. The truth was out there, and it would keep moving forward, even without her pushing it anymore. The next few months passed slowly, but they carried a quiet storm that never stopped moving. From the outside, the courthouse looked the same, but inside everything had changed. The whispers had turned into full investigations. The people who once walked those halls with pride and power now walked with their heads down, avoiding cameras and questions. The judge who had laughed at Maya, the officers who had whispered in the corner, and the network of people who thought they would never be touched. They were all facing the weight of the truth. Maya watched everything unfold, not as a loud voice in front of the crowd, but as the steady heart behind the story. She had done her part. She had collected every document, found the truth, and shared it with the world. Now it was the turn of the law, the journalists, and the people who had finally found their courage to speak. The investigation grew wider than anyone expected. What had started as a local courthouse matter expanded to state and national attention. Financial records from different departments were examined, and more names came up. People who had stayed silent for years finally stepped forward, sharing their own stories of unfair treatment, ignored complaints, and hidden deals. The judge and the officers were no longer untouchable. They were now subjects of legal action and public accountability. One morning, Maya received a call from Daniel. His voice carried both relief and strength. "It's happening," he said. "What's happening?" Maya asked, holding her breath. "They're officially announcing charges, not just against the judge and those officers, but against the whole network behind them." For a moment, Maya didn't say anything. She closed her eyes and let those words sink in. All the long nights of searching, the hours spent collecting evidence, the quiet steps she had taken, it had all led to this moment. A few hours later, she watched the live press conference on television. Officials stood at the podium surrounded by reporters. The lead investigator explained the case in simple, firm words. He talked about how millions of dollars had been misused. He explained how a system meant to serve people had been turned into a private business for personal gain. And then he said the words Maya had waited so long to hear. This entire network was exposed thanks to one woman's courage to speak up. Her decision to come forward has helped us uncover the truth. He didn't mention her name, just the word courage. And that was enough for Maya. She didn't need to be famous. She just wanted the truth to win. Outside, reporters rushed to cover the story. People across the state and the country were talking about it. Social media was full of discussions, not just about the courthouse, but about what happens when ordinary people stand up to powerful ones. In the following days, the courthouse felt like a different place. The judge was removed from his position. The officers who had laughed at her were no longer wearing their uniforms. Several officials faced charges. Properties and accounts were frozen. What had once seemed like an unshakable empire was now just a broken structure, built on lies that had finally come to light. For Maya, this was not about revenge. It was about justice. She walked past the courthouse one afternoon, carrying a small cup of coffee. She saw the building with fresh eyes. This was the same place where she once stood alone, humiliated and unheard. But now the silence had been replaced with change. She sat on a bench across the street and watched as people walked in and out. They were talking openly now, not afraid like before. New officers and new staff had been brought in to clean up the system. There was still a long road ahead, but something big had shifted. Daniel joined her on the bench, holding a newspaper in his hand. On the front page was a headline in bold letters: $330 million corruption network collapses. Justice in motion. He smiled gently. You did this, he said. Maya shook her head. No, she replied softly. We did this, and the truth did the rest. She remembered the day when she walked down these same steps feeling small, carrying papers no one cared to see. She remembered the judge's cold look, the smirk on the officer's face, and the silence of the people sitting behind her. And now she looked at the same steps and felt no weight at all. In the following weeks, many people reached out to Daniel's news team, thanking them for the story. But there were also letters sent quietly to Maya's home, letters from strangers who had faced their own pain in that same courthouse. Some said thank you. Others said her courage had inspired them to speak up. One letter was from a woman who had once stood in front of that same judge. She wrote, I thought I was invisible, but your voice gave me mine back. Maya held that letter close to her heart. It reminded her why she had done it. Not for glory, not for attention, but for dignity. The months that followed brought more changes. The government put strict checks in place. The businesses that had been part of the network were shut down or taken over legally. The money that had been stolen was traced and returned to community projects, schools, health centers, and public programs. What was once used to enrich a few was now being used to help many, and something else changed too. The people in the community stopped looking down when they entered the courthouse. They began walking in with their heads a little higher, knowing that the system could be challenged, that their voices mattered. One evening, as the sun began to set, Maya walked through the quiet park near her home. The trees swayed gently in the wind and children were playing on the swings. She sat on a wooden bench and let herself breathe deeply. For the first time in a long while, she felt peace. Daniel called her again, but this time there was no urgency in his voice. He said, They're making a documentary about this case. They want to tell your story. Maya smiled gently and shook her head, even though he couldn't see her. Tell the story of the truth, she said. Not just mine. The truth belongs to everyone. She didn't want to be on posters or in interviews. She wanted to live quietly, knowing she had done something that mattered. She had turned her pain into power. She had taken humiliation and built it into strength. As the days passed, Maya returned to her normal life, but something inside her had grown unshakable. She no longer doubted her voice. She no longer feared power. She knew now more than ever that real change doesn't always come from loud shouts. Sometimes it comes from one person standing quietly, refusing to bow to injustice. The judge's empire, the one that was worth $330 million and built on lies, was gone. But the hope it left behind was worth much more. It was a reminder that no matter how strong a wall of injustice may look, it only takes one brave heart to find the crack and push. Maya walked home that night under the golden streetlights, the cool air touching her face. She thought about the journey, the courtroom, the files, the long nights, the courage it took to keep going when she felt alone. She didn't smile loudly, but her heart was calm. She whispered softly to herself, This is what justice feels like. And somewhere out there, others who had once been silent were now finding their voices. Her story had become more than just a personal victory. It had become a spark that reminded people that courage isn't loud, but it is powerful. It can break chains, it can rebuild trust, and it can change the future. The courthouse still stood, but now it carried a different weight. Not the weight of arrogance, but the weight of accountability. And Maya, the woman they had once tried to silence, had become the quiet force that changed everything. She walked on with steady steps, the night calm around her, knowing that even one person can bring light to a place that has lived too long in shadows. The empire was gone, but the truth remained, and stronger, brighter, and louder than ever before.